In the world of racing games, there are a few series that have persisted as long as Need for Speed. Multiple generations and millions of copies sold later, the blend of realism and arcade-style driving remains as appealing as ever. But as popular as the series has become, it's likely that many of its fans are not entirely familiar with its origins. So, on this episode of DF Retro, we're going back to 1994 to look at the original 3DO version of Need for Speed, its ports to Saturn, PlayStation, and the PC, and an obscure Japanese-only conversion featuring a completely different set of cars. Let's get started. The world of realistic console driving games has long been dominated by the likes of Gran Turismo and Forza, but that has not always been the case. Flashback to 1994. The 3DO interactive multiplayer was just 1 year into its short life. For those unfamiliar with the 3DO, it was a console platform developed by the 3DO Company, a company founded in 1991 by Trip Hawkins, the same man that also founded Electronic Arts just 10 years prior. It was launched for $700 and lasted just 3 years, but during its short lifetime, the system received some very impressive software. This connection between the 3DO Company and Electronic Arts played a significant role in gathering support for the new platform. EA produced many titles for the system, including one of the best iterations of FIFA Soccer, a new Road Rash, Shockwave, a Mercenary, a sequel to Space Hulk, Syndicate, Madden, and of course, the Need for Speed. This new take on driving games was designed to capture the sensation of sitting behind the wheel of a high-performance sports car using cutting-edge 3D graphics. It was developed by Electronic Arts Canada, but its lineage can be traced back to a different name, Distinctive Software Incorporated. DSI was established in 1982, the same year as Electronic Arts, by Jeff Sember and Don Mattrick. Yes, that Don Mattrick. The studio was known for producing a wide range of software for various computer platforms, but many of its biggest games were published by the now defunct Accolade. This selection of software includes what I believe to be the predecessor to the original Need for Speed, Test Drive. The Test Drive series first appeared in 1987 with its sequel, The Duel, Test Drive 2, hitting 2 years later. We're looking at the Amiga version here, but it was ported to many different platforms, including the Super NES and Genesis. While crude by today's standards, Test Drive was designed to simulate the feeling of piloting a powerful supercar. Sound familiar? DSI would be acquired in 1991 by Electronic Arts, where it became known as EA Canada, and just 3 years later, its latest driving experience hit the market. Road and Track presents The Need for Speed. And thus, a franchise was born. Featuring cutting-edge 3D graphics, a realistic depiction of actual cars, and brilliant handling, the Need for Speed gained the attention of racing fans the world over. Unfortunately, seeing as it launched on the 3DO, few have ever had the chance to experience the game in its original form. Now, the game has certainly aged, but there is an appeal to the visuals on display here. We see a mix of fully 3D and two-dimensional elements here. Much of the distant scenery is rendered as 2D bitmaps, with the jump to 3D models for select objects as they approach the camera. The track itself is entirely 3D and features sharp curves, steep hills, and tunnels galore. It was a sight to behold. There were multiple views to choose from here, including a cockpit view, which depicted the interior of each car, complete with working gauges. Unlike subsequent installments in the series, this original game was slower paced and focused on the sensation of driving above all else. There was no music, just the sound of your engine and the wind rushing past your car. and nailing the curves required real skill. It felt as if you were out there alone on the course, just you and your car, attacking the curves and enjoying the scenery. The game of course featured a nice selection of different tracks and courses, a variety of domestic and import cars, and well, the X-Man.
You got two options. You can take this baby out and run her up against the clock. Or for the initiated, I suggest a little challenge. A little one-on-one, a little mano-a-mano. Come on, you know what to do. Let's go.
Yes, this was the face of the original Need for Speed. With his smirk that taunted every loss, this smug jerk even had his own option right on the main menu, and it was awesome. This was the era of full motion video after all. Of course, by today's standards, the presentation does feel dated, but there is still a certain sensation to the experience that remains fun. And while the 3DO was of course a very powerful home console released in 1993, it was also perhaps a little bit too early when it came to rendering 3D smoothly. As a result, games like the Need for Speed didn't exactly run at a high frame rate. As you can see here, it's a mix of inconsistent frame times and a low average frame rate that is almost always under 20 frames per second. It's not fluid at all, really, but you also need to consider the competition at the time to fully appreciate what's going on here. Case in point, just a couple of months after the Need for Speed was released, Stunt Race FX hit the Super NES, looking like this. Now the Super NES was of course much less powerful than the 3DO, and although I did love Stunt Race FX back in the day, this gives you a good idea of what home console owners were playing back then. The Sega Genesis also had its own conversion of Virtua Racing, using the SVP chip that had been released earlier in '94. It runs reasonably well considering the hardware, but it's still a far cry from what you could achieve on 3DO. Even the PC was behind here. NASCAR Racing by Papyrus Design Group, which is an amazing studio by the way, was released in 1994, and while it's incredible in its simulation, the performance and visual quality lagged far behind 3DO. Now, the arcade scene was of course still far ahead of home technology, as I discussed in my video on Daytona USA, but when it comes to home racing games, nothing could match the Need for Speed. Thus far, everything I've shown has been captured on a real 3DO console. If you want to play the game today though, that is certainly one way to jump in, but with its low frame rate and lack of availability, there is actually a better option, an emulator known as 3DO Play. The game runs great via emulation now, and thanks to a CPU overclock feature, you can actually bump up the virtual CPU to a full 30 MHz from 12.5 MHz, resulting in a much more stable frame rate as you can see. The emulator also supports outputting the graphics at their original resolution rather than going through the interpolation phase that we see on a real 3DO. After all, 3DO games run at 320 by 240, but the hardware itself interpolates that up to 480 interlace mode, something which can actually be worked around with a mod in some cases. But clearly, this was not the only way to enjoy Need for Speed. The game was released on multiple platforms following the 3DO version, starting in 1995 with the first PC iteration of the game. This version hit the streets 1 year later for MS-DOS with modified visuals and some significant changes. An improved graphics engine, an entirely new menu system, and new gameplay options all made their appearance here. The X-Man, unfortunately, is nowhere to be seen. Right from the start, it's nice having everything clearly labeled here in the front end. It's a big improvement over the original menu on 3DO, which felt confusing and somewhat sluggish. The addition of a tournament and single race mode also has a pretty serious impact on the game. You see, the 3DO version was limited to just a one-on-one duel with the X-Man, but here it's possible to race against an entire pack of cars. At this point, the game is certainly starting to feel more fleshed out. Of course, once you jump into the cockpit, it quickly becomes apparent that the gameplay isn't quite the same. The game is faster paced and handles somewhat more like an arcade game. It does play very nicely indeed, but it has a very different vibe than the original 3DO iteration. You can also see here that the visuals themselves have changed in a number of ways. The textures appear to be redone, and the game has a slightly darker tone to it. More impressively, the PC version also offers support for full 640x480 graphics as opposed to the lower resolution 320x240 original. Of course, it was possible to run in low resolution mode on the PC, and most users likely had to settle for this back in '95, but you could see that the platform was evolving with these new options. The racing HUD is also completely redesigned here. On the flip side though, like the 3DO version, the PC version lacks any sort of music during the race. The PC version also allows you to adjust various settings dynamically within the game simply by using the function keys. A neat and very useful feature at the time. Considering that I first played the game on a 486 DX266, these function keys got some serious usage. Personally, this was how I first experienced the Need for Speed back in the day. Now, it didn't run especially well on my original PC, but once I upgraded to an AMD K6, everything was like butter. And Need for Speed was a huge success on the PC. For years to come, it would become the best place to enjoy the series. But of course, Need for Speed enjoyed other ports to other systems, including Sega Saturn and the Sony PlayStation. While the two are very similar on the surface, there are a lot of subtle differences between them that are interesting to note. But first, let's check out the redesigned menu system here. Again, the front end was overhauled this time specifically for consoles, and this applies to both versions. The entire thing now operates at a very smooth 60 frames per second, making navigation through the various options much smoother and easier than before. Compared to the 3DO original, we immediately see a noticeable difference in terms of presentation. The Saturn version shares a darker appearance with the PC version, complete with modified textures. If you look towards the sky, the 2D background can be seen scaling and shifting based on the camera position over on 3DO, while on Saturn, it remains completely level at all times. You'll also note that in the cockpit view, the gauges on the Saturn version are blank and do not function at all as they do on 3DO, relegating that important information to a new HUD instead. Of course, there is one other similarity here, however. The Saturn version once again lacks music during gameplay. Beyond that, you've probably noticed by now that the speed of the game is much higher in all of the post-3DO releases. It's impossible to get a perfect like-for-like image here in this comparison simply because the cars move so much faster. A good way to look at it is like this: the 3DO original is a driving game, while the Saturn and other versions could be considered racing games. There's a distinction there to be sure. Of course, going beyond the speed of the game itself, we also know that the game runs pretty slowly on 3DO with a frame rate that is generally below 20 frames per second. On Saturn, however, we see something very different. Most of the races tend to stick to 30 frames per second, leading to a smooth overall experience. At certain points, of course, we do start to encounter drops below this line into the mid-20s, but it's still a far cry from the sluggish 3DO original. The Saturn version compares quite favorably to the PC version running on a decent rig from that era. Speaking of the PC version, here's how the Saturn stacks up against the PC. The original DOS version clearly runs in a higher resolution here at 640x480, but at the same time, it's also limited to just 8-bit color. That's 256 colors. The console versions make use of a higher color depth, which means smoother color gradients across the artwork in many cases. You can really see this here in the clouds where there is obvious color banding on the PC there. As for gameplay features, the Saturn port includes the tournament and single race options from the PC version, but also adds in a nice split screen option. This mode works supremely well here, and is the first time that split screen would be made available in the series. We also see the introduction of a time of day option, which lets you select between morning, daytime, or evening. Overall, the Sega Saturn version is a great iteration of the Need for Speed. A smooth, stable frame rate, lots of options, and awesome racing. But how does it stack up against the PlayStation version then? Well, in many ways, this is the same game. But if you look closer, you'll start seeing plenty of interesting changes here. For one thing, the skybox has changed again, and this time, the background moves along with the point of view as we saw in the original 3DO version. This same background also changes based on the stage. In this first section of the city stretch, we see a different background between Saturn and PlayStation, but in the next section, which is loaded separately, the game switches to the same background that we see on Saturn. So additional artwork has clearly been added to the game. The PlayStation version also adds cool new effects, such as the lighting added in this tunnel as you drive through, something absent in the other versions of the game. Now, of course, both versions do run at a higher color depth than the PC version, but due to the dithered output that you get on PlayStation, it ends up looking a lot grainier than it does on Saturn. At least the gauges in the cars function here on PlayStation. But perhaps the most important addition here is the music. Finally, the PlayStation version offers players the chance to enjoy music while racing. With a great blend of rock and electronic music, the pounding soundtrack helps bring the game to life in a big way. The tracks were composed by multiple people, including the late Saki Kasukas, who worked on a huge number of EA games, and Jeff Van Dyke, the talented musician who would eventually work on titles such as the incredible Alien Isolation and Assault Android Cactus. Clearly, their music played a significant role in defining the early sounds of the Need for Speed series, but it would be Need for Speed 2 where things really took off, I feel. Perhaps we'll look at that one in a future episode. Another curious difference between the two lies in the frame rate. On PlayStation, Need for Speed operates with an uncapped frame rate which sees performance hang just above 30 frames per second most of the time. This of course results in added judder that appears less fluid than what we get on Sega Saturn, which is a mostly locked 30 frames per second in comparison. Both versions do play much more smoothly than the 3DO original of course, but the uncapped frame rate is an odd choice here. Ultimately though, both the Saturn and PlayStation versions are great games and mostly pretty similar, aside from the aforementioned differences, and both offer excellent high-speed driving action that remains a lot of fun to this day. But this was not the end of the original Need for Speed just yet. EA returned to the PC in 1996 with the Need for Speed Special Edition. Updated to run in Windows now, Special Edition brings many of the improvements found in the console versions back to the PC, along with some further refinements. The music is here, the visuals are enhanced, time of day is added, and more. You can even play using a network connection for awesome multiplayer action. Of course, the game's interface and front-end menu has been completely redesigned and improved from the original PC release. We see more options than before, and a nice interface to allow you to appreciate the cars and tracks available in the game.
Displayed its first road car at the 1962 Tokyo Auto Show.
This is the menu system that most closely resembles what we would find in later installments in the franchise then. There are also a pair of new tracks in here, including this one, Burnt Sienna. As a result, Need for Speed Special Edition stands as the most complete version of Need for Speed available, and perhaps the best way to play the game. Both the DOS and Windows versions of SE can be easily played using things such as DOSBox or a virtual machine. But this was not the end of the original Need for Speed. In Japan, the series was known as Overdriven, and each release was basically the same as the Western counterpart, but with the Japanese language option. That is, aside from a set of specially localized releases with a rather different focus. I'm talking about Nissan Overdriven Skyline Memorial for the PlayStation, and Nissan Presents Overdriven GTR for Sega Saturn. I only have the Saturn version here, but both of these games featured the same basic content as the original Need for Speed, with a completely different set of cars and a new soundtrack. As you can imagine, the focus is placed on the Nissan GTR line of cars. What's interesting here is that the pace of the game is actually slowed down somewhat compared to the original Saturn and PlayStation releases, so the game winds up playing more similarly to the 3DO original in some ways. They are still based on the updated engine, of course, but it's interesting to experience the difference. In the end, the original Need for Speed was released many times over from 1994 up until 1997, for multiple platforms. This game laid the foundation for the franchise and remains an interesting title to return to even today. It's fascinating to see the development team grow and change over time with each new iteration of Need for Speed. It really feels as if the team was learning how to refine and improve its vision, which would ultimately go on to benefit the sequels. As a franchise then, Need for Speed is well beyond the 100 million sold mark, an amazing thing to consider when looking back on its roots. Starting life on a niche, failed console could have been the end, but Electronic Arts maintained faith in the brand and allowed the team to build a variety of incredible sequels over the years. But with that, we've reached the end of this reflection back on the original game. But with so many other titles in the franchise out there, this certainly won't be our last look at the series. I do hope you enjoyed watching this video, and if so, be sure to like, subscribe, and follow us on Twitter. And while you're at it, I would love to hear what your favorite game in the series is, and which ones you'd like to see covered down the line. But until next time, stay retro.
Well, 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 look who's here. Another warrior comes a-knocking on my hallowed halls.
Congratulations. You've just won an all-expenses-paid county vacation.